Where does the Quran come from? It's a question that sounds deceptively simple, but once you begin to unpack it, it opens up some of the most complex and contested debates in Islamic studies today. Are we talking about the origins of the text as a written codex, the development of its language, or the religious and cultural world it emerged from? In this episode of the Real Talk podcast, we're joined by Dr. Süleyman Dost to explore these questions through a bold and methodologically distinctive approach. His book, Before the Quran, sets aside the long-standing debates over the reliability of later Muslim sources and instead turns to epigraphy, archaeology, and linguistics for evidence rooted firmly in the pre-Islamic past. What emerges is a striking reevaluation of the Quran's linguistic environment, its theological vocabulary, and the religious landscape of Arabia on the eve of Islam. From the decline of paganism and the nature of Arabian monotheism to the contested influence of Syriac and the potential role of South Arabia and Ethiopic traditions, stay tuned because in this episode we cut right to the heart of how to reconstruct Islamic origins. Thank you, Dr. Dose, for joining us on our platform to talk about your most recent publication.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, and it's a pleasure to have you. Your book, Before the Quran, Material Sources at the Advent of Muslim Scripture, has sparked quite a bit of discussion in the what we like to call the Islamic studies sphere, especially around its main premise and its use of material sources. So without further ado, we'll jump right into it. Your book sets out to answer a seemingly simple question. Where does the Quran come from? Can you explain the exact parameters of this question? Are we talking about the origins of the written text itself, its language, or its narrative content? How is the way you are tackling this question in response to the way it has been answered in previous scholarship?
Thank you. The very simple answer to this question is my interest was primarily in the Quran's religious language. I sometimes use the word idiom. So when the Quran talks about certain things, such as prayer, such as punishment, I was wondering where these concepts were coming from. Whether they were tested in languages before the Quran, which is obviously the case, but which languages? Where do these languages originate? Where do we have material evidence for the use of these similar concepts? Same thing with Christian and Jewish concepts in the Quran, where they might have originated from. So, in a kind of very simple way, I was interested in the Quran's religious vocabulary, primarily divine names in particular, God's own name in particular in the Quran. I, of course, would like to discuss the biblical stories in the Quran because that makes a big chunk of it and it gives us a lot of context about the Quran's emergence. But at the same time, since my primary material are inscriptions and they don't have sustained, biblical material, so I didn't get that part. But if you look at the way the book is organized, it's divine names, religious vocabulary, and the Quran's historical geography, so the place names that are mentioned in it.
And
The
this part,
origins of this book was a doctoral dissertation that you
Mhm.
begun like a decade ago. Since you've completed that dissertation, how much has the field evolved in its attempt to address Islamic origins, and how much did that affect the degree you had to revise your dissertation
Mhm.
when you were preparing this book for publication? Has the new evidence, in your view, like strengthened or weakened your original central argument? And do you still believe your book to be a timely intervention for the field?
Yeah, I can give a very long answer to this, but let's start with this. Um, One maybe short answer to this is the book looks pretty much nothing like the dissertation. Although, the questions are similar, the premise is the same. I last checked before, it went to publication, and something like 30% of the book is actually from the dissertation, and the rest is mostly new material. And the reason for that is exactly that we're living in a very fast-paced scholarship. We're inhabiting a very fast-paced field. And when I started out, this was, 2014, 15, it was a time when the idea of Syriac Christian background for the Quran was extremely popular. And I myself was very much interested in this. I studied Syriac for 3 years when I was at the University of Chicago, and I thought that Syriac could inform a lot of the Quran's discourse. But eventually, you could say I was disillusioned a little bit in terms of Syriac's kind of penetration into the Arabian Peninsula. Focusing on Syriac dominance could lead for people to argue that the Quran could have been born someplace else. And it's not necessarily that I thought the Muslim tradition was telling the truth. I was genuinely curious how we can contextualize the Quran, even if we stay fully in the revisionist paradigm, which is, let's focus on the material sources. But Syriac Christian sources before Islam are not the only material sources. There are inscriptions. So when I started out at that time, again, this was kind of very close to the peak of Syriac Christian studies and its background for the Quran. Reynolds' book, Biblical Subtext, and Emran's dissertation in the book. And I greatly benefited from those works. But I was a little bit thirstier having read those books and, how far and how else can we go? And at the time, of course, all ancient South Arabian inscriptions were very well known. There was a very nice database that I could use, but also so many inscriptions that are not in the database. Ahmed El-Jalal and other people were working on Safavidic. But I remember, there were so few Paleo-Arabic, and at the time we called them pre-Islamic Arabic inscriptions, that I had to look at, whatever is available in terms of ancient North Arabian inscriptions, ancient South Arabian inscriptions, Nabatean inscriptions. Since in the last 10 years, the field has accepted the Arabian context of the Quran much more than it did when I started. That's one reason. And the second, since we have many more Safavidic and Paleo-Arabic inscriptions in our disposal, I had to adjust some of the arguments. I had to add, obviously, some of the new material. There was a lot of new archaeological work that has come out in the last few years. So I had to incorporate a lot of those. At the end, the premise of the book, which is, the Quran, I think, is an Arabian text because of its affinity with these Arabian inscriptions. Of course, it remained the same. But for example, at the time, I believe the argument was much more novel in the sense that Syriac Christian background for the Quran was much more popular. Now it's diminishing. So that's why I say in the introduction, I sometimes ask myself, should this dissertation be a book? Because, people agree now. People agree that the Quran is an Arabian text. Nobody, as forcefully as they did before, argue that the Quran could be from Syria and Mesopotamia. But at the end, I've seen, shoemakers creating the Quran, Guillaume D's work. So I realized that there's still some doubts maybe on this issue. So my goal was, let's clinch that argument with some new material. But at the end, the book became quite different from the dissertation. I'm hoping more enriched with, more new material. And some, I would say, methodological acuity in the sense that you have to make your arguments a little bit sharper, right? So that's the end result. But I would say in terms of the book's main argument, which is the Quran seems to be the product of West Arabia, and more specifically West Arabia towards the center of the Arabian Peninsula. To me, new evidence, all it does is it, strengthens that argument.
Yeah, and I was going to say before I found out that your current book is like 70% different than the original dissertation, I was like, man, this book is actually way ahead of its time. If it was a dissertation that was started, 10 years ago,
Yeah.
I thought it was only just a single chapter that might have been different. But after hearing your response to our question, okay, so that explains a lot. And so the imbalance that you highlight in historic and contemporary Islamic studies that neglects the Quran's lexical and ritual connection to South Arabia, how did it emerge? Is it due to the later Islamic tradition's own prioritization of Northern Arabia when contextualizing the origins of Islam?
Yeah, another good question. So there are multiple reasons for this. One is definitely, as you mentioned, Muslims moved northward, right? And when they did, the context in which the Quran was born in my opinion, was very different from the context in which it was understood and interpreted. This means by the time Muslims started writing, pieces about the Quran's interpretation, tafsir, reading traditions, etc., at that point they were living next to Syriac-speaking Christians, people knowledgeable in Hebrew, if not speaking it, obviously, but Jewish scholars. And they were born in that environment. They, probably associated the text they have in front of them, the Quran, with what they learned from those people, maybe, what they heard from them. So I realized at some point that, rarely Muslim scholars would talk about something having an origin in, let's say, classical Ethiopian, the Ge'ez language, and be right. Whereas, for example, they could be right when they're saying that a certain word is in Syriac, which again makes sense because they're living closer to the authorities of those languages. So that's one reason. Muslims moved northward. Maybe they forgot how a place like Mecca had a lot of connections with Southern Arabia. That's one reason. The second reason is, of course, again, the dominance of the Syriacist paradigm, right? So, when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? So if you know Syriac, there's so many similarities, and I acknowledge that, the way the Quran talks about certain things. And at some point when you realize that, well, first of all, the Quran has a lot of Syriacisms, Syriac related narratives, etc. And then there's not a lot of Syriac in the Arabian Peninsula. A reasonable conclusion is, well, maybe the Quran is not from the world that it claims to be, or at least the Muslim sources claim to be. Maybe it is from the world of Syriac Christianity. So that also kind of pulled the Quran's origins a little bit further north, right? So my goal in trying to identify affinities, parallels with, South Arabian and Ethiopian traditions is to kind of pull it a little bit back. Not necessarily pull it all the way to the south, which is definitely not what I argue, but definitely to show that if that is how this imbalance is created, maybe showing the other side of the picture, we could have a better balanced view. So again, there are multiple reasons why this happened, and part of it is from the Muslim tradition, part of it is from the way the scholarship developed. I always say this to, again, my students as well, that when we started, I was a student for Dana, and when we started working on, early Islam, the Quran, etc., in graduate school, I have so many of my Islamicist friends, early Islam scholars that ended up being early Islam scholars, that studied Syria. Not many of us studied Ge'ez. Not many of us had the chance to study Ge'ez. Not many of us had the chance to study ancient South Arabian, ancient North Arabian, Nabatean, etc., which I had the chance when I was at Chicago. So that's why I think I wanted to show that angle a little bit more, maybe, to address that imbalance.
In terms of the reliability of the Muslim tradition, your book attempts to sort of bypass that quagmire that has plagued the field for quite a long time, which is the reliability of Muslim sources. You focus almost exclusively on epigraphic and archaeological evidence that could be securely dated to the pre-Islamic period. What limitations does that place on the conclusions you can reach, given that we still have a relatively small number of surveys and excavations undertaken in the region? And is it really possible to completely avoid relying on knowledge acquired from the Muslim tradition entirely, particularly in regards to, textual and linguistic analysis?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a good way to look at my book, and in that way, the book is essentially a thought experiment, and the same thing with the dissertation. So what happens if we ignore the Muslim sources? And I think this was the revisionist ideal, and I would say I'm inhabiting that ethos. That okay, I mean, this is a big debate: Muslim sources reliable or not, to what extent, which one of them, which genre, etc. Let's leave it aside and try to locate the Quran's religious world purely based on pre-Quranic sources. And at the time of the dissertation, I thought we had enough material. I would say today it's even more. But again, I'll leave it to the reader whether like I was able to accomplish that. Answering that question without necessarily resorting to Muslim sources. But I think it is possible, and I think my hope is I was able to show it in the book. The question about, is it really possible to completely avoid relying on Muslim sources? Well, it is impossible. Because in the very least, as I say in the book as well, the vocalization of the Quran that we're using, the lexicon of Arabic, the words from the Quran, some of which have, other cognates and languages that can inform our knowledge. But, there's an entire kind of lexicographic tradition in the Islamic world that we are depending on when we're trying to understand the Quran. So I guess what I tried to do is, like, while acknowledging that, I wanted to cut the noise that comes from the Muslim kind of history and exegesis as much as it was possible, and focus primarily on material evidence before the Quran to answer the question, can we locate the Quran's origins with this kind of methodology? That said, I have to make maybe myself a little bit clear on that methodological issue. I don't necessarily think that all pre-Islamic poetry is not pre-Islamic. I think there is much merit in works of prosopography, works of genealogy. They are too detailed and disinterested enough to be historically reliable. But again, this is a methodological choice. And I made that choice because I thought some findings of, revisionism in Islam, in early Islam, were mistaken. And I thought this could be shown even using that same methodology. And at the same time, again, I submit to the methodology because I like that skepticism. I enjoy that ethos to the extent that it uses all the available evidence to answer that question, which is where the Quran came from.
And it seems like for a long time it was a matter of prioritization. It seems like, okay, we had sources that were more contemporaneous, but then we also had the later Islamic sources as well. And it seems like there was no prioritization in what we should put first. At least that's what I took from Krona reading her introduction to Meccan pagans, where she also said, it's completely impossible to kind of get off the shoulders of classical Islamic scholarship, but it's just a matter of prioritizing sources, which doesn't seem to have had, which hasn't seemed to have been clarified within the field, at least what she was writing at the time that she, wrote that introduction to. I'm sure things have changed, and it seems like we're moving in that direction, and your book is a really good step forward in that direction, in my opinion. And you state in chapter 1 that the composition of the Quran and its collection into a codex in the Hijaz around the mid-7th century appears as an extraordinary event, as it seems to emerge from a land which had no surviving written culture in Arabic, beyond some inscriptions which, if collected together, would be considerably shorter than Surat Yasin, which I found surprising, a mid-sized chapter of the Quran. Can this relatively low number of pre-Islamic writings in the Arabic script lead us to conclude that the Quran was born within a primarily non-literate oral culture, or is this historic lacune simply caused by the perishable nature of the material they used?
Let me first state that, this is the kind of question that, experts better than me could answer better than me. Like, people like Michael McDonald who work on this question of, orality, literacy, etc. The reason I wanted to start with something of a, you could say, provocative thought is that the script in which the Quran is written is, the Arabic script. The amount of texts that are securely datable before the Quran in that script and in the Arabic language, that corpus is extremely small. It was much smaller, 10, 20 years ago, but even now it's very, very small. And my concern to mention is not necessarily to say that, like we're dealing with a text that came out of nowhere. My main concern was to tell the reader that our material sources about pre-Islamic Arabia on the eve of Islam are extremely limited, especially those that would matter the most. But at the same time, that limitedness should not compel us to make overarching arguments about literacy and the predominance of orality, etc. a lot of the problem is, again, this has been shown by scholarship recently, right? By works of Marian and others. As soon as the Quran appears in writing, and we can debate, when that happens, but as soon as it appears in writing, there are clear signs of a scribal culture and training in the Arabic script. While we don't have quite a bit of material evidence about this, but again, you have to understand that the number of Paleo-Arabic inscriptions, again, Arabic inscriptions in that script before the Quran, before Islam, they were something like 10, like actual number was 10, 20 years ago. At this point, it's a little bit over 50, but that's a huge change, which means, did we look enough? Did we search enough to make an argument about, Arabic being primarily oral language? So, excuse me. The reason I'm bringing that up there is, first of all, we have to acknowledge our limited knowledge about the Arabian Peninsula. It is growing. We are still at the kind of tip of the iceberg. Very recently, like as Ahmed Al-Jalad was saying, very recently now we have something like 20 ancient North Arabian inscriptions around Mecca, which is these are huge things, right? These are huge developments. So we shouldn't jump to a lot of conclusions about orality, writing traditions, literacy, etc., before we have enough of an evidence. But it remains to be the case that we are dealing with a very small amount of texts when it comes to Paleo-Arabic, a huge, obviously, corpus when it comes to especially Safavidic and Hijazi, which are, in dialect continuing with Arabic, which means, they're essentially Arabic texts in a different script. So these are good enough to give us an approximation, and that was my goal. We have to approximate as much as we can to the context of the Quran, to the world of the Quran, by using these material sources, while acknowledging that there's so much we still don't know.
Just to help our audience who might not have a comprehensive understanding of the linguistic landscape of pre-Islamic Arabia, could you tell us to what extent epigraphic sources have provided historians with a window into that diversity and the history of Arabic, and what really was the linguistic landscape that we're looking at?
Yeah, and the very short answer is just go ahead and read chapter 1 of the book. But of course, I can of course summarize here. So on the one hand, a kind of simple way to look at this is the Hijaz is being kind of covered and circled by multiple scripts and possibly languages. In the south, we have a very long writing tradition of ancient South Arabian, more than 10,000, often well-preserved inscriptions that are really long. Quite a bit of them are from the polytheistic past of Southern Arabia, but there are also quite a few from the kind of monotheistic period. And then in the north, we have ancient North Arabian inscriptions. As I said a minute ago, especially Safavidic and Hijazi are extremely important for the history of Arabic, but also by their sheer size. We have so many of them that they can be great points of data when it comes to linguistics, when it comes to let's say popularity of a certain deity, etc. And then, of course, we have Paleo-Arabic inscriptions, which are not many in number, but extremely important because, again, these are Arabic texts before the Quran. And they are written in a script that slowly and gradually developed from the Nabatean script, which means in terms of, you could say, its cultural impact, Nabatean inscriptions and the so-called Nabateo-Arabic inscriptions, these all have or could potentially have some bearing on the history of Arabic, on the linguistic and religious and cultural background of the Arabian Peninsula. So again, our knowledge is getting so much bigger over time that, for example, when I started the dissertation, we didn't have many ancient North Arabian inscriptions around the Hijaz, right? There were some, for example, around Yathrib, but that was basically it. But now we have from Mecca. We have a very small amount of Paleo-Arabic inscriptions, most of them in modern-day southern Syria and Jordan. not even from the Arabian Peninsula, right? So now we have quite a bit of them from Najran and quite a bit of them from the Hijaz, from the area around Tabuk, Mecca, Medina. So this is the situation we have now, and it's kind of unfortunate that the chapter that I've written will be extremely outdated in a couple of years because of how fast this is developing. But at the same time, we have mutually unintelligible languages with Arabic, like ancient South Arabian, but again, a huge corpus that could be very useful for understanding pre-Islamic Arabian religiosity. Same thing with Safavidic and Hismaic, and with the advantage that they are in a dialect continuing with Arabic. And then also quite a bit of unworked, undeciphered, maybe unclassified ancient North Arabian inscriptions. The point is the kind of corpus that we're dealing with is huge, and we have to do something with it. Right? Instead of complaining we don't have enough, let's work with what we have.
This episode is brought to you by Melatayon, a brand new platform for live humanities education launching April 15th. Here is the idea: real scholars teaching real courses, live to anyone in the world. We are talking PhD holders and doctoral candidates in subjects such as history, classics, philosophy, theology, and literature. People who have spent years in their fields and actually have something to teach. If that sounds like you or someone you know, Melatayon is currently looking for founding instructors. Your design, your own course, you set your own price, you keep 85% of tuition, the platform handles everything else. Enrollment, payments, Zoom, the whole thing. Apply now at melatayon.com. That is MELETEON.com. Applications are open now, and courses go live April 15th. Back to our regular programming. And so has been a long-standing debate about the religious makeup of the Quran's immediate audience, with some academics arguing that it emerged in a polytheistic pagan reservation or pagan corridor, and others arguing that its religious community was almost entirely made up of Jews and Christians, with any kind of polytheistic practice having long died out. In the latter scenario, the Quranic mushrikun could merely represent a polemical literary construction or be a historical attestation of imperfect, unaffiliated monotheists with henotheistic practices. How much does your study of the language of the Quran and its relationship with epigraphic sources help to resolve this debate? And did physical idol worship still exist within the Quran's immediate context, in your view? And does the Quran provide a historical witness to the last stand of paganism in Arabia?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's quite a bit to unpack in that question. It's a very multifaceted question. So first of all, I guess we have to make a distinction between belief and practice. And this is an important distinction when it comes to, for example, conversion of people to Christianity in the early Christian period. So it is possible that one gets rid of their multiple gods and be a believer of one God, while keeping some and sometimes many of their pagan practices. And to me, this is fascinating because, cyclical, seasonal practices that are tied to the agricultural seasons and landmark events could be very hard to die. So, for example, you could always accuse somebody of quote unquote not being a perfect monotheist for keeping some of those practices, and that was very common. And one could even argue that the pre-Islamic Hajj was a pagan practice that was transformed by Muslims, which still keeps some of those pagan habits from those times. But when it comes to the physical idol worship, I could say that it's almost entirely polemical and hyperbolical. I see no evidence of it on the eve of Islam, and scholars often agree with this as well. And I see no evidence of it long before Islam. So as I said in I think chapter 2, as far as we can tell, within the kind of Arabian Peninsula, gods did not have statues, but stones were often associated with gods and practices around them. So again, in chapter 2, I talk about, for example, Nusub stones and Awthan, which were, again, very popular in southern Arabia. So that's one way to look at it, right? We're not talking about, if you watch, for example, Ar-Risala, the the movie Message, like if that's the image of what Arabian religiosity, paganism looked like before Islam, maybe that's a little bit exaggerated. But you also have to understand within one God worship, imagine that we all are monotheists in the sense that we all worship one and same God. You can still have disagreements over key issues like resurrection, end of the world, heaven and hell, etc. So that's what I'm seeing when I'm looking at the sources, right? That is, yeah, I mean, they all look like monotheists, at least going after the 5th century. But certain practices might have continued for a while. And especially things that have, material relationships with deities could have continued for a while. Even in, Kitab al-Asnam, other than talking about, the Book of Idols by Ibn al-Kalbi, even outside of talking about, gods having physical materials, it talks quite a bit about people erecting stones in the middle of the desert for cultic purposes. That seems to be very popular, maybe all the way until the beginnings of Islam. So it's a very complicated question, but one thing that you could easily say is that, yeah, maybe no idol worship, but a lot of stone-related materiality and physicality, especially around issues like, practices like animal sacrifice. And I think, as I said in chapter 4, some of these must have continued all the way until the coming of the Quran. Because the Quran seems to talk about very specific things with a very specific language, as if some of these practices are going on. Some of it is not just polemical hyperbole, some of it seems to be some practices on the ground.
I really like the term you used, residual paganism. I mean, I don't know if it will be coined in the future in academia or anything, but it seemed to make sense for what was going on. That, okay, and we've seen this from what I understand of Christian Europe when it transitioned from its pagan beliefs to Christianity. It didn't totally drop, of course, in belief, it dropped a lot of those practices, but in practice, however you want to frame it, but it kept a lot of those practices, such as birthdays, the holidays, seasonal things that were going on. And yeah, you kind of it's easy for me to believe that the same was going on within the Arabian
Yeah, and
context.
that's the normal course of life. I mean, people did not have academies that you could, indoctrinate everybody, which is the right way to believe and right way to practice. Um, and again, I like giving this example. So, one of the biggest changes that were implemented to the Hajj by the Prophet, by the Quran, towards the very end, was the end of intercalation,
Mm.
which made it possible for the Hajj to be the same season every year. By adopting a fully lunar calendar, which the Quran does, and in very strong language, saying that, intercalation or postponement, I think is a better translation, is worse than kufr, or like, it's an addition to kufr. And the reason is, again, I would say it's trying to make it less pagan by making it not seasonal anymore. Because this is very normal for people every year having started their sowing season or having their harvest, etc. It's very normal for people to go back to some of these practices that they've been doing.
In terms of pagan practice, you highlight that the Quran cites only a very small proportion of Arabian deities by name in comparison to the sort of diverse pantheons that we have attested in early epigraphic sources and the 20 odd divinities that are recorded in Ibn al-Kalbi's Book of Idols. So what can epigraphy tell us about the origin of the deities that the Quran does choose to include? And can it answer why it chooses to cite only those specific ones?
Yeah.
What can these names really tell us about the geographical origins of Islam and the Quran itself?
Yeah, I think one point to highlight here is that when we talk about the Arabian pantheon, we're talking about like, hundreds of gods, if not more. So I think Tawfiq Fahd has a list, I think recently that there were better kind of updated lists, and we're talking about a ton of gods. And by the time we get to the Quran, of course, in the epigraphic record, they are no longer there, right? Forward, let's say 5th century, We don't see direct devotional text to these deities. But at the same time, the Quran seems to remember some of them still. It doesn't even, you could say it doesn't remember the most important of them, if that's one way to look at it. For example, the Sharat of the main Nabatean god is not in the Quran. Let's say, for example, the Muslim tradition remembers Hubal as the god of Kaaba, which is obviously not in the Quran, but also it is mentioned in a Nabatean inscription from Madain Saleh. So I wanted to, I asked the question myself, why these gods and why, three of them together, Allat, Manat, and Uzza, and five of them in a different context. I wanted to give an answer to this, which is, Lena Neyme's recent work shows that Allat, Manat, and Uzza were very popular in the Hijaz, in the Nabatean and Nabatean Arabic inscriptions. And by the time we get to kind of more pre-Islamic times, deities are gone. The direct devotions to them are gone, but theophoric names still keep them. So people still keep naming their kids, I guess, based on these three deities. So especially those three, their popularity seems to be still on, at least in people's recent memory, in personal names. And this is like, we're talking about 400 kilometers north of Medina, right? So to me, that was one way to think about it. These are all Nabatean deities, or at least at one point, they were all Nabatean deities. They were all very well known in the north part of the Arabian Peninsula. Among the Safavidic writing nomads, they were very well known, especially Allat. Al-Uzza was an Nabatean deity. Manat was a Nabatean deity, but only insofar as we can tell, more popular in the Hijaz. I made the argument that the five Noahic gods represent the Quran's memory of some gods that were even deeper in history, that their popularity even didn't last as much. So, for example, Ibn al-Kalbi again makes that point. Some of those deities do not even have any theophoric names associated with them anymore. So people didn't even keep calling their kids with those names anymore. And I made the argument that some of these, if not all of them, have connections with South Arabia, which in his review, Ahmed contended, but some of them have, right? Wed is a South Arabian deity. Nasr, Ahmed focused on the NSWR word, but Nasr, NSR, is well attested, I think at least 5 times attested in the South Arabian inscriptions. Ya'uq is a weird case. It's not a god, it's the name of a synagogue in one South Arabian inscription, which I find interesting, not necessarily good evidence. I find it interesting that if that's the only evidence we have, it could be considered, part of that South Arabian locality and lore. But at the same time, the fact that the Quran doesn't talk about a ton of these gods, and only in 2 places, in 2 sets, maybe you cannot bow to it, but it's coming from a biblical story. This means that these gods were gone. They were not nearly as popular as they used to be. Allat, Manat, and Uzza are exceptions a little bit because of, again, it's not too difficult for someone to make the leap from seeing somebody called Abd al-Uzza and thinking that, that's a deity, that's a goddess, and maybe, thinking about them. Not necessarily worshiping them, but at least knowing their presence. So when the Quran talks about these, the way I look at it is, one, it is talking about memory. It's talking about some past. Some of it is recent, some of it is not so recent. Maybe Allat, Manat, al-Uzza's popularity and maybe even deification and worship were a little bit closer to the time of the Quran. But, the ones that are mentioned in Surah Nuh, they're probably much more older. And, that's the Quran's way of saying, I mean, we're putting them to the time of Noah. That's how old they are, But again, it should tell you something about, the Quran's selection of a very small sliver of Arabian deities, that these deities were not that popular anymore.
In chapter 3, you engage in an in-depth study of the inner chronology of the Quran to determine how the Quranic names used to refer to God evolved over time. The content of this chapter was not covered in your original dissertation. What inspired you to add it to this publication, and what crucial questions do you hope it will answer for the field?
Yeah. Um, I like the way you put the question, which is, yeah, it wasn't a dissertation. Why did you come up with it? Um, it was very experimental, I have to say. And the reason I wanted to go that road is one, I was normally gonna just talk about, Allah, Rab, and Ar-Rahman, and well, these are all attested in the Arabian inscriptions. There you go. Rahman is a South Arabian god. Allah is more kind of Hijazi, etc. But while doing this and just basically looking at the Quran and the way it is used, I noticed some patterns, and I wanted to dig a little bit deeper. And I thought maybe this would answer one question that I always had in mind. Should we take the question of inner chronology seriously? For the longest time, as a good revisionist, I said, no way. I mean, Quran could have been compiled in many ways. The issue is unsalvageable. There's no way. But then when I read, Sinai's works, and again, he talks about it in multiple places, I was somewhat convinced that mean verse length could be a good starting point. Definitely not the ending point, but it could be a good starting point. And then we can build on it. We can maybe perfect it. We can make it a little bit better. So that's how I started. And I thought I got something, which is, and I still stand by it in the sense that I feel like there's a big chunk of the Quran that Allah is not mentioned at all. Now we can discuss why that's the case, and you can also kind of refuse some of my kind of assumptions about why there is no Allah in the early Quran. But something is very obvious. Allah becomes the name of God eventually for good. You go to something like chapter 9 of the Quran, Bara, Rab is forgotten, Rahman is obviously forgotten. So I thought there's a pattern going on. So I wanted to pair an internal criterion of inner chronology, which is MVL, mean verse length, based on Sinai's work. And I wanted to see whether it could tell us anything about the way God's name develops in the Quran. So that's why I went that route, I guess.
Okay.
In terms of the critiques about an attempt to securely construct a relative chronology, obviously you've avoided the dependence on Muslim sources by relying, like Sinai, on mean verse length. How would you respond to scholars like Mehdi Shadel, who argue that the use of stylistic markers like mean verse length to establish chronological development will inevitably, in a corpus as large as the Quran, it's going to result in a continuum, and that could be arbitrary and dependent on unproven premises. For example, could an alternate explanation for a difference in mean verse length simply be a function of diverse genres of text within the Quran rather than a chronological marker?
Yeah, I agree with that criticism to the extent that every corpus could end up like a continuum if you do that. What mean verse length could be useful is if you can come up with clusters within that corpus that seem to have distinct stylistic and lexical affinities that don't need to depend on the mean verse length. And this was again something Sinai himself argued, which like that's maybe the only leap of faith you have to do, which is, it seems that the corpus is growing in terms of its length. And maybe you can disagree, maybe that's the other way around. But what I tried to do was to identify clusters, because mean verse length does not help you to decide between two chapters that have close mean verse lengths. But then if you start with that, and then add more still fully internal criteria, such as, for example, the name of God, which is very similar to the way the biblical documentary hypothesis started out. Then you add, for example, new vocabulary. And you notice that with a certain cluster of mean verse length comes certain types of vocabulary, which is not always tied to the style, which is not always tied to the genre itself. So that's why I tried to come up with a kind of overarching chronology that never uses the Muslim tradition, in the sense that I don't even accept the Meccan and Medinan division. I'm relying on basically three fully internal criteria. One is mean verse length, that's the starting point. Two is the name of the deity that is mentioned, with some adjustments that Sinai himself made. And third, the cluster of certain vocabulary showing up in different parts of the text. So completely unexpected stuff came out of this, which I didn't explore fully in that chapter because I'm hoping that this will be my next book, and like this more like a teaser, I would say. For example, the word Arabi, when the Quran talks about its Arabianness, it always shows up in chapters that I consider to be the AR Quran, which is, when the names Allah and Rab X are kind of interchangeable. It's not in the early phase of the Quran, which I consider the Al-Quran, never. It's never in the so-called Medinan Quran, or the one that I call the A-Quran. Now, this could mean nothing, but there seems to be a pattern that is slowly emerging from these things, right? Recently, I made a presentation in Tübingen on the question of, for example, when do Ge'ez words seem to join the Quran, so to speak, to join the Quran's vocabulary? There too, I'm noticing some patterns, right? So, for example, words that are often associated specifically with Hebrew, like Sakina, seem to be fully late Quran, fully kind of third phase of the Quran. So I understand all those criticisms, and I actually shared them quite a bit. And mean verse length in and of itself is imperfect, for sure. But can we build on it? Can we identify problems in it? And I'll say one last point on this. If you look at, for example, the last, let's say, 30 chapters in the Quran in terms of their mean verse length, quite a bit of them are chapters that are considered late Meccan. They shouldn't be there. They're sitting next to, quote unquote, clearly Medinan chapters. But there's one criterion that I thought was almost like golden, and I mentioned in the book, the Allah per verse average in a given chapter. In that cluster, you look at it, all the so-called Medinan verses have more than one Allah per verse average. So like you can easily weed those quote-unquote Meccan chapters out by the simple criterion, which is again truly internal to the Quran, truly about which names of God does the Quran use, right? So like something like Surah Ra'd, which is not supposed to be there based on its mean verse length, can be taken out from that cluster because of how many times the word Allah shows up in that chapter. So I think this is like, again, it's experimental, and I was exploring some questions, but I think there's something in there that I want to explore a little bit more.
Sounds really interesting.
I mean, just to one more additional sort of criticism that could be raised is that, in line with Nikolai Sana, like you said, you argue at several points that several of the surahs contain interpolations that date from a later period in the development of that surah, and you use the pattern you established in terms of mean verse length and the different appellations for God to identify those interpolations.
Yeah.
Does that not become like a convenient means to explain away discrepancies within surahs that don't match the pattern you're arguing for? So you get sort of almost an unfalsifiable, self-confirming analysis, if that makes sense.
Great question. If I had done this all by myself, I would say you're absolutely right. But the reason I went that route is, if you look at, again, Sinai's own work, there is this verse sitting in the middle of, Surah Al-Muddathir, that's so absolutely long, very unlike the rest of the surah. And it is explaining why it mentions, alayha tis'ata ashar. On it, there is 19, or there are 19. Now, you could always say, well, that the Quran stopped there and gave a long sermon. That's one way to look at it, right? Another is, well, that should be later. How later, when? That's another question, but it is absolutely destroying the surah's mean verse length. It's like 5 lines in and of itself, when the rest of the chapter is like 3 verses in a single line, etc., etc. The way Sinai looks at it is, well, if it's violating the mean verse length that badly, it must be later. You may or may not agree with it. The thing that interested me in this was that verse is the only time the word Allah shows up in the surah. You look at chapter 73, Muzammil. The final verse is extremely long, explaining something that was mentioned at the beginning of the surah. Now, again, maybe you say that God intended to write a very long verse at the end. That's fine. The point is, Sinai identifies it as an interpolation. What I'm seeing is that that's also the only verse in that whole chapter that has the name Allah in it. Now, وَالْأَمْرُ يَوْمَئِذٍ لِلَّهِ at the end of another verse. وَمَا تَشَاءُونَ إِلَّا أَن تَشَاءَ اللَّهُ رَبُّ الْعَالَمِينَ. Another final verse in a chapter that is supposed to be, early Meccan. Violating mean verse length, sometimes violating the rhyme, and the only time the name Allah is mentioned. So I saw a pattern over there. And then I said, Sinai goes so far. For example, there are some verses that he identifies, and yeah, those are the only ones that Allah is mentioned in the entire chapter. But what if those interpolations are stitched together a little bit better elsewhere in the early Quran? Would there be a pattern to identify some of those interpolations when they do not violate mean verse length, when they do not violate rhyme? So when I did this, there remained something like 10 cases of Allah to be explained, as opposed to, let's say, 40 that we had already discarded because of Sinai's own criticisms, right? So that's the kind of leap that I'm personally making, because a lot of other people had already identified these as later interpolations. And when I say later interpolations, I have to be clear. It could be the case that they were interpolated at a time, quote unquote, the third phase of the Quran, when Allah ended up becoming the name of God.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not like we're talking about, post-Quranic, post-Muhammad. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that the Prophet himself could have been, making adjustments to the Quran as it went along. But by the time he made those adjustments, it was settled that God's name is Allah, and we're going to use it, right? So that's why my understanding is, whatever I identify as the Quran or the earliest phase of the Quran is heavily edited. It could be because Sinai says so. That's one way to look at it, and I adopted some of his interpolations, and some others were based on my own reasoning. And again, I would completely understand if people don't follow that reasoning and don't accept it.
Yeah.
But I see a pattern. Let's put it that way.
I mean, and I really thought it was an interesting chapter. I've never come across any study like that. I don't know what to make of it. I need to read more into
Sure,
the whole
yeah.
mean verse length thing, but I found it to be a very interesting chapter. So how does the chronological distribution of the Quranic appellation for God alter a common supposition that they are seemingly equally valid and interchangeable? What light do epigraphic sources shed on why the names are distributed in the way that you identify? And what can they reveal about the communities the Quran was interacting with in the course of its development and its own changing confessional orientation?
Yeah. So again, the simple answer to this is Ar-Rahman is a very clear case, right? So the southern appellation, let's say, for God, and shows up in the Quran at some point. We can pinpoint it chronologically. We could agree or disagree, but it enters the picture at some point. It is intensive for a while. It is mentioned quite a bit in some chapters, in some like 6, 7 chapters, and then it's dropped. Except Basmalah, and we can talk about it, but it's dropped within the Quran. And while it is being dropped, the Quran is giving signals about some discontent about it. People are saying like, Ma ar-Rahman, what is this God that we're supposed to worship? There's a closure to all of this when the Quran says, call God Allah or Ar-Rahman. He has all the beautiful names. So this is fine, but don't be stuck with the name. Don't make it a big deal. And then what I consider to be one of final stages, the Quran kind of tells its audience that, yeah, this is a foreign name. That's something that you're not really familiar, by putting it in the story of Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. When the Queen of Sheba opens the letter, إِنَّهُ مِن سُلَيْمَانَ وَإِنَّهُ بِسْمِ اللَّهِ الرَّحْمَنِ الرَّحِيمِ. So that tells me that, in the Quran, there was this search, maybe, one way to look at it. What are we going to call God? And again, if people buy my understanding of early chronology, for a while, the Quran avoided giving a name to God. It's a good, convenient I say method to say your Lord, my Lord, X's Lord, etc. You're not mentioning God, and it could easily be read as a Jewish reflex or a Judaizing reflex where you're avoiding naming God. And when the Quran decides at some point, and that's when I think the cluster changed from one to the other, and you can say chronology changed, you can say context changed. The Quran says, well, Rahman is God's name. But then there's opposition to it, and the Quran kind of makes a decision. Muhammad makes a decision, however you got it. And then it starts calling Allah and Rabb together as if they're interchangeable. So to me, when I say in the second phase of the Quran, yes, it starts out with a proper name that is dropped, and then Allah and Rabb X, as I call it, ends up becoming interchangeable. And eventually, and this is one way to read it again, I'm trying to make conclusions from this chronological reading, right? By the time you get to the third phase of the Quran, what I call the A Quran, first of all, the Qibla has changed. One way to put it is Muhammad has nothing to owe to Jews, right? And then there's something, again, I would call a rapprochement with Meccans begin to pop up. Now you start seeing mentions of Hajj and Umrah, which wasn't in the Quran forever. Mentions of things like awthan, practices around, these kind of stone structures, etc., start to pop up. These are all in the late Quran, right? It's not in the Meccan Quran. To me, what this change signals is that now the Quran is accepting the Hijazi way of calling God, which is Allah, and ends that debate. God is Allah. So what, to me, again, like, for example, Ahmed al-Jalal in his review mentioned, well, this could be stylistic. Yeah, but what stylistics don't explain is why Rabex is almost fully dropped in the A Quran. And it's almost entirely restricted to, prayers, Rabbi, Rabbana, etc. Like if you look at Surah An-Nisa, very long surah, right? 160 something mentions of Allah against 4 or 6, I don't remember. I have a whole list. Surah Al-Baqarah, 3 mentions of Rabb X. I mean, why? To me, that signals the fact that he made peace with his people, accepted that appellation. The question of what are we going to call God is gone. It's Allah and it's over. So as you can see, I'm trying to, again, start with a pattern that I noticed and trying to match it with, the epigraphic data and the chronology. And I fully understand that there are people that don't agree with the chronological side of things. There are people that maybe don't agree with the connections with epigraphy. But one thing is obvious, Ar-Rahman, is a kind of, it's signaling a change. That's at least pretty obvious to me.
You already just alluded to the Basmalah and that issue, and your analysis does encompass its inclusion in the story of the Queen of Sheba, which is the only occurrence of the Basmalah within the body of a Quranic surah. But you don't examine how your analysis would address the Basmalah that introduces every surah apart from Surah 9. Do you view this Basmalah as extraneous to the Quranic text, as a later post-prophetic addition that was affixed to the surahs retrospectively when the Quran was codified? And if you don't, wouldn't its presence at the start of every surah not undermine the idea that Ar-Rahman was sort of abandoned as a divine appellation by the Prophet midway through the development of the Quran?
Yeah, the short answer is I don't think Basmalah is part of those verses. Part of those.
Okay.
I don't think it is. I don't think it is. I think it is a good convention to separate surahs.
Okay.
That came out when the Quran ended up being a book, and they looked for that convention within the Quran, understandably, and they found like this is a great, opening phrase that we already have from the authority of none other than Suleyman, a prophet that starts his letter with this. In the name of God, Ar-Rahman. But it has some bearing on the way we read the Quran's kind of development, I guess, in terms of divine names. So by the time the Quran is mentioning it, I think the way you have to translate it, as I do in the book, in the name of God, small g, Ar-Rahman, proper name of God, who is merciful. To me, that makes great sense to read it as such. When the Quran mentions it in the context of Kunashiba, at that point, Ar-Rahman is God's proper name. Allah is small g, there's one way to talk about God, but the proper name is Ar-Rahman. But again, like to me, it's almost obvious, but I think a lot of people will agree that Basmalah is not part of those chapters. It's a later addition. And even in the Muslim tradition, when they're counting verses, they only counted for Surah Al-Fatiha. They never count for other chapters.
And one of the predominant trends in recent scholarship in the field that your book establishes itself as a response to is the Syriacist trend. Sorry, almost butchered that. Could you
I even don't know. I think it's Syriacist is the best way to put it.
Syriacist? Okay, the Syriacist trend. Could you explain how this trend emerged, why it has become so predominant and distinguished, any variants of approach within it?
Okay. First, let me start with a lot of appreciation of this trend. Syriac Christian sources survived in large numbers from pre-Islamic times, an incredibly rich literature in a language that is cognate with Arabic, with very similar concerns that came out of this mess of, Second Temple and kind of early Christian world. Things such as heaven and hell, end of times, qualities of God, attributes, etc. Which means that when you're reading Syriac literature, and I did for quite some time, you see as if like you're looking in the mirror as somebody that knows the Quran. There's so many similarities. And it is very easy, I guess, to be captivated by the fact that, this is too eerie, this is too similar. And it is in some cases very, very similar. And when, it started out as a sensation in the early 2000s with the works of Christoph Luxemburg, and kind of gradually developed into a rigorous academic, I would say, paradigm, I was very much influenced by it. I mean, there's so many parallels that you can draw between the Quran and Syriac Christian sources. The question is what to do with those parallels, right? And, linguistically speaking, in the very early days of Orientalism, with the works of Mingana and Jeffrey, etc., there was even this kind of underlying trend that, it's obvious that the Quran has so many Syriac in it. And almost every single work that was produced in the so-called more recent Syriacist trend, they almost always refer to Jeffrey to make that point, that Syriac was so dominant in the Quran's religious language. So when I started this project, that was the kind of norm that, obvious, right? I mean, Syriac is at the background of the Quran. The thing is, again, if you read more Semitic languages, if you read all South Arabian texts, and again, Safavidic texts, Hismaic texts, if you read Geʿez, well, those parallels are there too. The problem is we don't have vast, extended religious literature in those languages that are clearly pre-Islamic, so that we can see which one is closer to the way the Quran talks about these things. So Syriac sources remain in their kind of throne as this only truly extensive parallel to the religious language of the Quran, which could lead some people to think, well, maybe that's where the Quran is coming from. That's the Quran's world. So that's the thing that I was very unhappy with, because to me, it requires a few steps to get there, right? Were there enough Syriac-speaking Christians in the Quran's world? Is it possible for authors like Ephraim to be translated, or at least well-known enough in the oral literature for these ideas to seep into the Arabian Peninsula? And to me, an even bigger question was, well, there were Christians and Jews in southern Arabia, let's say. And that's we're sure, right? I mean, we're not talking about Mecca and Medina, but in southern Arabia, they were. Well, we don't have any of their literature surviving. Does that mean they didn't have any of it? For 2 centuries, Christians in Southern Arabia, didn't they have liturgy? Didn't they have some form of biblical stories and texts translated into the language that they speak and that they use? The fact that this didn't survive, again, doesn't mean that they didn't exist. So Syriac has the great advantage of surviving. All right. And I talked in the book, it's mostly, by chance, it's fortuitous that we have so many of those. So we shouldn't jump to the conclusion that, because of this parallel, because of these similarities, that the Quran's world is one of Syriac Christianity. That was my problem. It doesn't negate the fact that, it's an extremely useful literature to understand the zeitgeist of the Quran, to understand the type of questions and anxieties that existed at the time of the Quran. So it is a compelling paradigm, and I personally benefited from the works that were produced in that paradigm when they were, linguistically, philologically, and kind of reasonably sound, and many of them are. So that's how I started. That's where I started. You can say my main goal in the dissertation, and it was kind of a little bit toned down in the book because Syriacist paradigm is coming down quite a bit as well in terms of its popularity. But that's how I started out. I wanted to put some doubts into people's minds, if you put it that way, about the predominance of Syriac Christianity as a background for the Quran.
You state in the book that there are numerous phonological overlaps in the way both Ge'ez and Quranic Arabic borrowed from Aramaic. And they borrowed the way that they borrowed Aramaic words suggest either that the Arabic forms were adopted from Ge'ez, quite possibly via South Arabia, or that both languages received them from an older dialect of Aramaic that was evidently non-Syriac. Several scholars like Jan Retsu, Marian van Putten, and Ahmad Al-Jalad have argued that there is a strong possibility of the latter, that in numerous cases Arabic could have very likely got these words from a dialect of Aramaic that was more archaic than classical Syriac.
Yeah.
How is it possible to reliably distinguish which of these possible vectors of transmission were more likely? Are there any strict criteria which can be adopted that will aid in identifying the most relevant cognate systematically, or are we playing a guessing game, basically?
Well, part of it is above my pay grade. I'm not a linguist, right? I'm a historian of religion trying to understand this world. But what I'm noticing is one, again, and let me, before this interview, I kept this image in my mind and I can't let it go. There's a story in Rumi's Masnavi, and it's an old story, probably older than Rumi, where a town hears that an army will pass through their village, their town, and they hear that there's an elephant in the army. But they've never seen an elephant. They don't know what an elephant looks like. And the army shows up in the dark. They put the elephant in a dark barn. People are so curious. They get in the barn and start touching the elephant to figure out what an elephant looks like. And somebody comes out and the elephant looks like a huge tree trunk because they touch one of the legs. And somebody else comes out and it looks like a pipe because, the way sometimes we're dealing with the Quran is similar to that, right? I mean, we're partially in the dark and it's getting better and better, obviously. But so this assumption that there must have been a form of Aramaic that is lost, I mean, that's a good assumption that makes quite a bit of sense. But again, I mean, we don't have the evidence. Same thing goes with the kind of intermediaries that we don't have anymore. As I said, let's take like a word like hawariyun. The word hawariyun is a perfectly Ge'ez word. No question about it. It exists in Ge'ez long before Christianity entered Aksum. We have evidence of this before Christianity. When Christianity enters, that's the word that they use for the apostles of Jesus. So we have something like, let's say 150, 200 years for this word to start in Ge'ez as a very specific terminological word in Ge'ez to appear in the Quran. What happened in between? Did, for example, South Arabian Christians adopted that word as a terminology to talk about Jesus' apostles, and then it entered? We don't know. So having those gaps, a form of Aramaic that we don't have evidence for, a form of, or a vast literature that might have existed, not necessarily vast, but some literature that might have existed in ancient South Arabian, in, Jewish and Christian understanding. All of these are not there. So we're trying to kind of, just like those people in the dark barn, touch things and try to find. But to me, there are certain things that are obvious, right? Which is a lot of the Quran's Christian vocabulary, as I argue in chapter 6, seem to have parallels in Ge'ez. Again, I don't know how that happened. In terms of, did it come directly from Ge'ez? Was there a form of Aramaic in between? Was it all South Arabian in between? We don't know because we don't have the sources. What we have is the word Hawariyun means apostle. Hawariyan in Ge'ez is apostle in Ge'ez. 2 centuries later, it shows up in the Quran. Pretty much the same word, right? So we're trying to, I guess, as a kid's, game, connect the dots and try to come up with a reasonably clear image of how things look. But to me, what is even clearer is arguing that the Quran's religious language is predominantly Syriac. That's absolutely false. That's the thing. That's the kind of hill that I would die on. It could be that there's a lot of Aramaic in the Quran, no question about it. My reasoning is I would expect from a text that has so much supposedly Syriac in it to have some of the key Christian terminology to be in Syriac. To me, that I couldn't get past that point that the word for apostle in the Quran is a Ge'ez word and not a Syriac one. I guess if I may make myself simple and clear on this point. Other than that, the mechanics of this, as I say in the book very clearly, I'm kind of not saying anything because there's so much I don't know, there's so much we don't know in terms of the scholarship and the kind of sources that we have.
Can you provide another example of a key Quranic term for which Ge'ez origin seems to be a clear, better fit than any other possibility, and for which the Ge'ez parallel might actually enhance our semantic understanding of the Quran's use of the word?
Yeah, I mean, I have some examples in the book, right? So, Ma'idah,
Yeah, table.
in Arabic today it means a table in the context of food. It means the same thing in Ge'ez, but also in Ge'ez it has the significance of being the word that is used for the Last Supper of Jesus, right? And of course, the Quranic passage about Ma'idah is very elliptical, very kind of enigmatic, but it seems to be talking about the Last Supper, right? So that to me that enhances the way we understand the word Ma'idah. Same goes with Hawariyun. Same goes, for example, again, there must have been some intermediaries, but the closest pre-Islamic word for the gospel, Injil in the Quran, is the Ge'ez Wangil. Now, as Ahmed says, it shows up in pre-Islamic poetry, quote unquote pre-Islamic poetry. It could be. Again, my methodology was so that I don't use pre-Islamic poetry. But in terms of securely datable pre-Islamic sources, that's the closest form that we have, right? Maybe by the time we get to Old South Arabian, again, Christian literature, it was already something like Wingil or Ingil, and like by the time we get to the Quran. So like these are, to me, good indications. And I have to say, Stefanie Rudolph from Tübingen is soon going to publish a book on, Ge'ez words in the Quran, which again, mine was just focusing on some Christian terms, but I'm hoping there will be kind of more on this in terms of how much Ge'ez in the Quran. But even a word like munafiqun, not necessarily quote unquote the Christian terminology, it's a perfectly Ge'ez word. And it's used in the context of disbelief, heresy, etc., commonly in pre-Islamic Ge'ez words. And I'm hoping one intervention that I tried to do in that section is, back in the day, there was always the escape, so to speak, for scholars to say, well, if something shows up in both Ge'ez and Arabic, it is always possible that Ge'ez got it from Arabic. Because most of the Ge'ez literature Although we knew that it existed before Islam, but most of the actual texts are from post-Islamic times. But since we have, carbon dating evidence for the Garima Gospels, I used them specifically, those Gospels specifically, to say, well, if a word shows up in those texts, and this includes words like Jahannam, again, a good Ge'ez word, Shaitan, the closest form that we have to the Quranic Shaitan, Saitan in Ge'ez, they all show up in the Garima Gospels, right? So I'm hoping people see that, I'm not saying that, and I said it very clearly in the book, I'm not saying let's replace Syriac dominance with Ethiopian dominance. That's not the point. But all of these are good examples to show that Syriac dominance paradigm has some problems, some big problems.
In terms of replacing the sort of predominance of one a series of cognates with another, Juan Cole has argued in his article on the polysemy of the term kafara in the Quran that trying to identify the origin of an Arabic term through the lens of a single cognate might blind us to the polysemy of Quranic Arabic and the complexity of how the diversity of the linguistic landscape of pre-Islamic Arabia could have shaped Arabic and a term's multiple meanings. Is that a danger of a philological analysis?
For sure. I mean, we have to be kind of serious in the sense that our evidence is often limited, and words in the Quran sometimes change meaning within the Quran. This is one of the tools that we have, right? Not the only one. It's one of the tools. We can look, how a certain word is being used in a different language, Quranic language. Maybe at some point we could even come up with some kind of priority. If a word shows up in a Paleo-Arabic text in Mecca, maybe it has more weight in understanding a Quranic word than, let's say, a word in Ge'ez, etc. But I definitely agree with Juan's assessment on that point. I definitely agree with my colleague Walid Salih's famous etymological fallacy article. I mean, these are waters that you want to tread a little bit carefully, right? You shouldn't get to big conclusions, like unless a case is very clear. Again, in the case of Hawarian, for example, this very obvious in Ethiopic word. And another point is, again, in the Quran, words change meanings, right? And I mentioned, I think, at least one example in the book. I'm kind of keeping them for other times. But the word deen clearly changes meaning in the Quran. And I think there's even a chronological aspect to it. In half of the Quran, deen means final judgment. In the other half, it means something like religion, right? I'm saying not religion, but there's two distinct meanings of the word. So, we have to be careful by making a big, judgment about a word from pre-Islamic times, especially in a kind of language that is not mutually intelligible with Arabic, being the source. But these enrich our understanding. That's another way to look at it. Whether Syriac, Ethiopic, another form of Aramaic, it makes, I guess, the Quran a little bit more enriched. Our understanding of the Quran a little bit more rich.
Okay. Although you highlight their lack of corroboration outside of Muslim sources, you cite the cultural memory of the invasion of Mecca by Abraha and the immigration of early Muslims to Ethiopia as still significant. How can they be regarded as significant for your argument given the unreliability of their sources?
Yeah, that was cheeky of me to mention those while saying that I'm not relying on the Muslim sources, right? But again, I only mentioned it as, so Muslim sources contain a lot from what you can call kind of northern traditions, right? So, we see so many parallels between, for example, Midrashic traditions and the way Tabari talks about a biblical story. And that's understandable. They're living there. To me, what is surprising is whenever the Quran, or I'm sorry, the Muslim tradition remembers something about their connection to the South, they're doing it against overwhelming odds because they're so far away, right? And they live in a different world. And I always give this example, and I think I must have mentioned in the book, I don't remember, but I'll definitely mention in other publications. And that's obviously a well-known point anyway. The person that is reporting the famous Najran I'm sorry, not Najran, the Abyssinian emigration is ends up being Muhammad's wife eventually, right? Salama. And when she talks about that, Muslims going, Meccans sending Amr ibn al-As as their kind of representative, Muslims having Jafar ibn Abi Talib, she uses words that are clearly in Ge'ez. Now, this we don't see a lot in the Islamic tradition. If this is preserved with authentic Ge'ez words by somebody supposedly spent so much time in Ethiopia, to me, this is a good indication that there's some reliability here. I still didn't use it in the book that much, in the sense that, it could be for any reason. But to me, it is significant that she uses the word Dabr for mountain, which is the Ge'ez word for Dabr. She puts it in the mouth of Najashi. She called their books Masahif. Mushaf is a Ge'ez word, it means book, it means codex. When, for example, the debate about, what should we call the written Quran? People started saying, oh, Jews call it Sifr. Shall we call it Sifr? Somebody came, Salim, Mawla Abu Huzayfa, and he said, you know what? When I was in Ethiopia, I heard them calling it Mushaf or Mashaf. So these are, to me, when there are linguistic indications, they might be significant. And of course, Abraha being a truly historical figure from inscriptions, etc., I thought, if Muslims remember back in the day, and something that they shouldn't maybe remember because of their northern bias, if they remember that the Prophet was born at a time when Arabia was being ruled by an Abyssinian ruling over Yemen, etc., to me, these are significant. Not necessarily the main part of my argument, but I find some significance in them. But you're right. I mean, I should be honest with myself. I shouldn't take it as evidence. And for example, I didn't use the fact that, Surah Al-Fil, for example, talks about Abraham, we can use it as part of the Quran's historical geography. No, because that entire interpretation comes from Muslim tradition, and I'm not using the Muslim tradition. Simple as that.
Does the available evidence that you've examined in regards to the origins of the Quran's religious vocabulary enable us to answer obviously the most, I think, debated question of how biblical and parabiblical religious content reached the Quran's immediate milieu? Does any of it help us to reliably solve the mystery of whether there was a meaningful Christian population, for example, in the Hijaz, or were the Jews rabbinic Jews, or were they more an idiosyncratic, isolated Jewish community? These are always the same questions we return to in the field, and it would be amazing if we could find the answer.
Yeah, I mean, that's, kind of $1 million question, and sadly, inscriptions can only go so far in answering it. But there are a couple of things, right? And I'm hoping chapter 6 of the book gives the people this idea that when it comes to very limited Christian vocabulary of the Quran, it seems to have an Ethiopic background. And again, what you make of it it depends, right? You could say that actually it's a South Arabian background, but we don't have that. So that's the intermediary. That's fine. And to me, that's very significant. Now imagine the scenario where whatever made possible for the Jesus's apostles to be called as Hawariyun would make it possible for Muhammad to know, the story of Moses, the story of, Abraham, etc. And one thing that I did more in the dissertation than the book was trying to show that if we take, let's say, and let me rephrase this, let's say that we're going to give Muhammad the chance to have only 3 books, as if he's in an island, to come up with a book like the Quran. Which 3 books would be enough? I always ask myself, I teach a course on the Bible and the Quran. And what I see is that if Muhammad had access to the book of Jubilees and the book of Enoch, one for apocalyptic traditions, heaven and hell, etc., creation, fallen angels, one for the biblical stories, you would cover something like 90% of the biblical stories in the Quran and 90% of the Quran's cosmography, etc. What else is left? Well, Jonah is left out. The way the Quran talks about Jonah is what, 9, 10 verses, all in a poetic form with very little detail. He could have heard it from somebody. That's not that difficult. Job is left out. The Quran talks about Ayub in 3, 4 verses. Very little detail. Moses, it's all over the place. The book of Jubilees being a digested form of Genesis plus most of Exodus, for example, would be enough, right?
Mm.
And it has all the bells and whistles of a biblical canon, at the time, at least according to Ge�z speaking people. Same goes for the Book of Enoch. So that's why indicating some affinities with the Ethiopian context could then lead us to start asking this question: what did Muhammad really need to know all of these? Again, if you're taking the idea that he was the author. And on top of that, again, with the Jubilees I mentioned in the books, there's so many things that the Quran shares with Jubilees as opposed to with the Bible, right? For example, Abraham's early years as an iconoclast, finding God all by himself, etc. I mean, it exists in Jubilees. It obviously exists in other sources as well, but it exists in Jubilees, but not in the Bible. So I think there's a long way towards that in terms of identifying. But if you would ask me that question, how many books would he need to have to write a book like the Quran, if that's your perspective? Jubilees and Enoch would be enough. You don't even need a third one. Some stories that he heard would be enough to fill those. And then you can maybe leap to another place and say, and sometimes people consider this, people like Noldeke, I think Alois Sprenge considered this. Well, if he had a guest speaking friend, that would solve a lot of problems. A lot of problems, I would say. But again, like these are different ways of looking at it. Again, as you can see, I'm mostly feigning ignorance because there's so much we cannot tell from the inscriptions. But I think Ge�z sources could be informative to a certain extent.
Do Syriac textual parallels that are often cited for key Quranic narratives, like the Jacob of Syriac's sleepers tradition, the Shana for the oracle name for the stories in Surah 18, or the Cave of Treasures for the repeated story of Adam and Iblis, do they coincide with any Syriac calques or loanwords? And if the literary parallels and the lexical evidence don't align in the case of such stories, does that undermine the possibility that such Syriac texts can be viewed as the direct sources which the Quran was evoking, or does it simply affirm that these texts would have undergone some sort of intermediary process of translation, assimilation into an oral culture whose linguistic landscape would have filtered them through maybe through words that were archaic Aramaic or Ge'ez origin, that had long since become an integral part of Arabic? So just basically those stories in particular have been such a focus for the field in terms of an intertextual analysis. So that's why I had to ask that question.
No, that's a great question, and I'm willing to consider these as holes in my argument, in the sense that still the closest parallels to the seven sleepers story is kind of from the Syriac tradition. You could add Dhul Qarnayn, etc. But again, I have to ask the same question: does it mean direct, textual transmission? Should we ask the question, for example, that, well, I mean, was there a Ge'ez form of the Alexander story? Probably, but again, we don't have the evidence. Same goes with the seven sleepers.
I mean, I'm always surprised by how many translations that Alexander narrative was translated into. I seen an article that I requested, although they never sent it over to me. That was a couple years ago, where an Alexander romance was also found in the Al-Hamiado language in Spain, which
exactly. I mean, then you wonder, I mean, a story that's so popular, so famous, could have entered the Arabic speaking world in from multiple ways, and like that shouldn't be our kind of yardstick to decide Syriac influence on the Quran. And it's completely okay if like that's where it started out, and then eventually it ended up, in the Quran. And I think Ahmed mentioned in his review as well, like maybe this is some parts of the Quran that is not Arabian, and that's fine. I mean, I'm willing to concede that. But then we have stronger evidence, right? Like someone like Shoemaker saying that the Quran's Christology being very similar to a church in Palestine, etc. Like the evidence should be much stronger, as Sinai criticizes him, and I'm not open to that idea. I'm open to those ideas, but I feel like the lacuna, the gap is so huge that one story having a parallel in Syriac, two stories having a parallel in Syriac shouldn't be enough for us to make those leaps. And there are all these biblical stories. Once again, I mean, they have Syriac parallels, they have parallels in the Syriac literature, but you have to understand these must have existed in Ge'ez. These might have, not must have, but might have existed in Old South Arabian. So we shouldn't jump into conclusions. We have to see them, and that's my approach, as incredible richness of evidence when it comes to understanding the larger framework of the late antique religiosity from which the Quran kind of feeds itself, right? So to me, they're extremely valuable. But then is it enough to say that the Quran came from a Syriac Christian world? I was like, no, not really.
Okay, so what is the current state of research on the possible intertextual parallels between the Quran's Christian content and Ge'ez inscriptions in
Yeah.
text? Is it completely unexplored, and is this largely due to the dearth of preserved pre-Islamic manuscripts?
Yeah, I mean that's the big problem, right? So there's a lot of Ge'ez that survived. Most of it is from what people call the kind of medieval period of Ethiopian history. Then you have to weed certain things out, whether whether those texts have Arabic backgrounds, vulgates, uh, whether um, you could identify texts that seem old and come up with some kind of method such as carbon dating to say that they're actually pre-Islamic. This was so much of a problem that you read someone like Wolf Leslaw, one of the most important scholars of Ge'ez, and he would say things like, Shaitan is clearly from Arabic to Ge'ez. Jahannam is clearly from Arabic to Ge'ez, because at the time there was not good evidence to suggest that there was pre-Islamic Aksumite literature on these that would identify these words existing before Islam. Now that situation changed quite a bit with the Quranic Gospels, um, but again, it's still very small compared to the Syriac literature, very small. And one thing I noticed is that, of course, people in Ethiopian studies don't care about our questions, which is, like, we really want to know if something is pre-Islamic or not. They have other questions, right? There's a long period called the Dark History of Ethiopia, and, different dynasties taking over, etc. But what I can say is that I think now I'm hoping I will convince more people to study Ge'ez. Maybe that's one way to put it. And then there's more work coming up. I already mentioned Stephanie Rudolph's monograph on Ge'ez words in the Quran. She uses a much larger literature than I do in my book, for sure. And then if more people focus on this, I think there will be more material. And although I don't consider this to be a key piece of evidence, I'm always fascinated by the fact that there were biblical inscriptions in Ge'ez in Yemen like a generation before Muhammad. I mean, this is something, right? This is something. Um, like, for example, it was too late for the book to include it, but for example, when Ahmed identified a Paleo-Arabic text with quite possibly a reference from the Bible, I mean, we have like 6, 7 of these from different sections of the Bible, from the Old Testament and the New Testament in Ge'ez. Like, to me, this says something about, for example, the biblical penetration of the biblical knowledge into Arabia. So hopefully there'll be more of it as time comes along.
In your final chapter, and this was actually my favorite chapter. I didn't see talked about too
Okay.
much on the in the online sphere of the discussion around your book. I also like chapter 4 as well. But Yeah, in your final chapter, you closely examine the Quran's inclusion of Arabian prophets that have no seeming direct parallel equivalents in biblical or parabiblical sources. How does the Quran successfully blur any distinction between biblical and non-biblical prophets, and why are the non-biblical figures particularly useful in identifying the Quran's geographical origins?
Yeah. First of all, whether this is historically accurate or not, the Quran seems to have a chronology in its mind
Mm,
of how some biblical prophets relate to non-biblical prophets in terms of who came first, who came last, after, etc. And that chronology, and I don't want to make a mistake, obviously. I'm trying to kind of keep it in my mind a bit more structured. But at least in the Quran's imagination, there's Noah, there's Hud, there's Saleh, there's Shu'aib, there's Lot. So what happens is they are sandwiched between two biblically known perished communities, and the Quran puts them in that line, in that chronology, so that when it talks about Hud, it can say, you guys came after Noah. When it talks about Saleh, it says you are inheritors of Hud's people. And when it talks about Shu'aib, it actually connects Shu'aib on the one hand to people that came before him, and then to the people of Lot. So now, and this is what, as I cited in the book, Franz Rosenthal would say, what the Quran is trying to do is kind of trying to make this transition seamless, as if like everybody knows that there were these prophets. It doesn't care if these are biblical and these are non-biblical. In the Quran's lore, or maybe in the people that the Quran spoke to, in their lore, this is how things happened, right? So in the Quran, there's no distinction. And the other way to look at this is maybe the Quran is Arabizing some biblical prophets instead of making Arabian prophets biblicized. What I mean by this is that there are good indications to suggest that Noah, the Quran considers Noah to be an Arabian prophet. Where is Al-Judi? Muslims say, oh, it's a mountain in the Arabian Peninsula. Uh, so the fact that it mentions Arabian gods in the context of Noah, maybe the Quran clearly believes that Noah was an Arabian prophet in the line of these other Arabian prophets. It's just that the people who know the Bible know about him as well. So I think like it's not, maybe you could see it as consciously happening, but I think it's more like subconsciously, the way the Quran thinks about this. Yeah, these are like, everybody knows it. These are prophets. It doesn't say these are Arabian prophets. But to me, the distinction is, and I think this is pretty obvious, but I would like to hear other people's opinions on this. When the Quran talks about the Arabian prophets that we call Arabian prophets because of their non-existence in the Bible, it gives away its locality or their locality. It gives away their closeness to the context of the Quran. So, for example, and I made a big deal about this in the book, right? So whenever the Quran gives more details about topography, sometimes even flora and fauna, specifically flora I mentioned in the context of Seba, when it gives descriptions of cities, houses, especially obviously for Medai and Saleh, which is on the cover of the book as well, it it has a claim to knowledge. It says, "Have you guys seen those houses? Tilka masakinuhum." Those are their houses. This is not the way the Quran talks about Moses.
mm,
This is not the way the Quran talks about Jonah, right? This means it, again, maybe subconsciously giving away its position vis-a-vis these people and saying that, yeah, these are a little bit closer home. You guys know about them a little bit better. And that's why I think I wanted to make that list of, let's look at all these details and the place names and try to put the Quran into some kind of geographical continuum. If such a continuum exists, the southernmost part of it is Marib, because it talks about, the two gardens of Marib, which again we have archaeological evidence for. It uses a Sabaic word to talk about Sail al-Arim, kind of flood of the dam. I talked about two, possibly fauna-related word that it uses in the context of the fall of Seba. And then in the north, you have things like, Median, Iram that is mentioned. Obviously, Al-Hijr, I mean, it's huge, right? Madain Salih. So, like, when I read this, the immediate conclusion I get from this, by again putting the Muslim tradition aside, the Quran must have come from a place that is close to Madain Salih. To say things like, you go by and you see their houses made up of carved rock, which again, technically not true. Those were not houses, but maybe it was used as uh, for habitation later on. But the point is, that much detail warrants some geographical proximity. And then it mentions the name Al-Hijr, which is again something that the Quran doesn't do a lot, giving proper names for cities. So that's why I thought this evidence should be considered holistically by looking at every single place name that the Quran uses. And then if you make a map, the Quran is talking about just a strip of land from the east of Sinai, maybe including Sinai, to the north, and to the south, Marib. It has Jonah, there's no Nineveh mentioned. I'm surprised that there's no Jerusalem mentioned, although, it mentions about the temple every now and then. It talks about Egypt the entire time when it talks about Moses and Joseph. Not a single place name, right? I don't know. No Kadesh Barnea, no Hebron when it talks about Abraham. So to me, these are indicative of the Quran's historical geography. And I'm not saying, and maybe this will be wrong to say, like, oh, the Quran doesn't know what's going on the north and south of this. No, the point is, maybe it is speaking to an audience that lives in this strip of land and maybe at the center of the strip of land. And this is the extent of their historical geography. They wouldn't understand if the Quran would say Nineveh because maybe they never heard about it. But they did hear about Medai and Salih. They must have heard about it. They must have known about the glories of Iram and the kind of abruptly rising rocky mountains of Wadi Ram. So to me, there's a lot to gain from looking at these small details about topography, place names, etc., to get a sense of the Quran's historical geography.
As you just summarized, you do this like incredible, very intricate tracing of all these topographical, textual, and archaeological references. And you conclude that all three of the Arabian prophets, or the ones that we refer to as Arabian, and their peoples were imagined in the Quran to be from very specific locations in northern Arabia. Unlike the zone locations, the identities of the actual prophets themselves can't be found in any source outside the Quran. So were they pre-existing, remembered figures that are lost now to unrecorded pre-Islamic oral memory, or were they allegorical figures that were innovated by the Quran that would have been equally obscure to its audience as they are to us? And if the latter, why would the Quran seek to situate figures that are completely unknown to both its pagan and biblical communities within very identifiable local locations? Because you yourself talk about the typologizing approach to narration that the Quran takes, and for that to function, you need an audience familiarity with the figures, because as historical cases that are presented as morally instructive need to be remembered, and meaning needs to be generated concisely through correspondence with inherited figures.
Yeah, that's a great question. So one thing you could easily say is that these locations must have been known by people. So they knew about Medina Sari. They must have been fascinated by it. These huge structures carved into stone. And I guess your next inspiration would be like, who were these people? If they were like great people living in these places, how did they come to an end? Because we have evidence that Medina Salih was not as populated as it used to be, at least based on archaeological evidence. So you're kind of going up and down on the kind of that western strip of the Arabian Peninsula. Like you're seeing all these great places. You're seeing like the actual ruins of the great Dam of Marib, let's say, right? And when you do this, it's very easy to go to the next step and start a whole kind of folklore about it, that there was a prophet, because that's the Quran's typologizing, right? I mean, there's a prophet, people don't listen to him, and they're punished. And then you do it with the added advantage of, these are places that maybe they imagine some prophets associated with it, but if you don't do it, I can do it for you. There was this prophet. You see all these camel drawings on stones. Well, there used to be a camel that came out of the rock and they didn't give him enough water and this led to blah, blah. So to me, that's not difficult to imagine how from imposing and fascinating architecture and remains came these kind of stories that Muhammad could, again, if he's the author, let's say, easily incorporate with the rest of the biblical stories. And most of the time, these are, especially in the north, are cities that used to be probably prosperous, probably associated with the kind of height of the incense trade, associated with the Nabatean rule. But the reason I think of these mostly as typologizing and not quote unquote historical figures is that their names are odd. Hud has a meaning. It means, penitent. Salih means righteous. Shuaib, well, it means little people, but, God knows where the inspiration is. And maybe they could easily be also, again, old figures that Arab lore remembered, and we don't have evidence for now. But to me, the key point is it was matching significant localities that lost their, let's say, luster that you could easily observe with possibly folkloric, possibly historical figures. To me, that leap is not hard to imagine. And to me, what matters is the Quran speaks with some familiarity when it talks about these places. It doesn't do the same thing as it does, let's say, with the story of Joseph at the beginning. If you remember, it says, well, you didn't know about these before. We're telling you now. It doesn't use that same, let's say, phrase when it comes to the people of Shu'aib, the people of Salih, etc.
One set of verses that revisionist scholars often focus on when problematizing the Quran's Hijazi origins are those referring to the ruins of Lot's people in Surah 37, which appear to imply that the Quran's community passed by the ruins of Sodom and Gomorrah near the Dead Sea on a daily basis, before proving that they could not be located in West Arabia, therefore proving that they could not be located in West Arabia. How do you make sense of these verses?
Yeah, I mean, I did this quite a bit in the book, right? So first of all, there are quite a few steps in order to argue that the Quran is from the Dead Sea region. One is, we don't know where Sodom and Gomorrah are. We assume they were around the Dead Sea. That's number one.
Right.
Number two, the kind of familiarity that the Quran normally associates with these quote unquote Arabian peoples, and when it gives actual place names, etc., for some reason is not there for the people of Lot. It doesn't mention Sodom and Gomorrah. It could have, I guess, but it doesn't. That's another step. Third, the Quran associates the geographical location of Lot with that of Shu'aib. And if Shu'aib is from Midian, which is, this is southern Sinai, or at least where Sinai is kind of joining the Arabian Peninsula, it is possible, purely based on that the Quran imagines that event to have happened close to Midian and nowhere near the Dead Sea. That's step number three. Step number four is that's the verse in the Quran that they're using. إنكم لتمرون عليهم مصبحين وبالليل. Nowhere in that verse it says you're passing daily. I know some translations do that. That's not the correct way to read it. First of all, the verse ends with musbihin, which is kind of the verse ending, which is the rhyme. What it's saying is you pass by it in the morning, and then it says, and at night. That's the beginning of the next verse. Now, what could this mean? I said clearly in another verse when it talks about an Imam Mubin, these were probably sites that were on major roads that people traveled. And it doesn't have to be the case that they did it every day, as Shoemaker and others would argue. They sometimes did it in the morning, they sometimes did it at night. And of course, these we're talking about poetic verses that are, trying to follow the rhyme. So mustahin, wabil. To me, you shouldn't read too much into it and say they did it every day. And to me, the biggest answer to that question is, and I'm fine, let's say, with a location in the Quran being in the Dead Sea region. It's that, again, I'm seeing that you have to make multiple steps to it. To me, the issue about the Quran's general historical geography is you have to look at it holistically, as I said. So that's one piece. But what about Madain Saleh when the Quran talks about it? What about the Great Dam of Mari? So to me, when you combine all of this, let's stretch the northern extent of that area of Quran's historical geography to the Dead Sea area. And to the south, it remains the same. It's the city of Marib, the town of Marib. We're still somewhere in like Yathrib, you know what I mean? Like, I'm not trying to be facetious about this. It's just that alone is not evidence for the Quran's historical geography. You have to consider all together and come up with an understanding. And people traveling could have known about these places, maybe as far as Dead Sea, right? Again, assuming that Sodom and Gomorrah were in Dead Sea. But I find it interesting that the Quran, when it talks about that particular story, uses the word al-mu'tafikat, which is kind of a biblical pun because that's the same Hebrew word that the Bible uses about cities that are overturned. But it doesn't give place name, unlike when it does with, Al-Hijr, Madian, maybe Alayka, Iram, etc. So you have to look at it more holistically before saying that because of that verse, the Quran is coming from the Dead Sea region.
How would you respond to Dr. Al-Jalad's critique of your interpretation of the lot verses, in which he suggests that it doesn't really solve the geographical dilemma that is posed by them because Mecca is even further away from Madian than the Dead Sea?
I'm not sure if I understood the question right. So Mecca, again, like somebody that has traveled to Madian, and if the assumption, the Quran's assumption is that, Sodom and Gomorrah or Lot cities were not far from there, could have gone from, Madian to that area. And it would still remain in the general kind of historical geography of the Quran. You know what I mean? So like, again, we shouldn't read too much into the verse musbihina wa bil-layl. That it could be part of their travels, that they sometimes pass in the morning, sometimes pass at night. And the fact that the Quran calls the people of Shu'aib and Lot on Imam Mubin, a kind of well-known road, is, to me, it tells that, we're talking about places that people visited with some regularity as part of their travels, as part of their trade, whatever you call it. But again, yeah, they were there, but it is part of a large geography that extends from, let's say, Sinai and Median all the way down to southern Arabia. So again, I'm trying to put it into a general context where it is one of those places people must have been familiar with.
So we don't need to be married to this idea that verse indicates a daily visit,
No,
a literal
actually,
daily visit.
it's definitely not the case from the plain reading of the Quran that they did it every day. No,
Yeah.
that's reading too much into the text.
Okay, so a Quranic argument against Hijazi origins that you did not address in your book, and we see this pop up frequently, at least in our comment section, is one first made by Patricia Crona. She argued that the Quran's numerous agricultural references do not fit the ecology of Mecca, including verses in Surah 6 which suggest that the Quran's immediate audience were agriculturalists. Was there a reason why you did not feel the need to respond to this argument, despite your focus on examining any geographical reference in the Quran's text that can help situate it?
Yeah, and the answer is, yeah, I didn't talk about it. To me, that's a ridiculous argument. And I have the utmost respect for Patricia Cronin, and whenever this pops up in other books as well, first of all, more than 90% of pre-modern economies were agricultural. You didn't personally have to be an agriculturalist, but knowing something about agriculture, knowing some people that are engaged in agriculture, having your everyday needs met by agriculturalists was so common that saying something like Meccans didn't have agriculturalists, well, what did people in Taif do?
I was
What did
about to say
people
that.
in the remainder of the towns in between those towns did? Most of them were agriculturalists. And I don't even, normally I don't want to accept the fact that in Mecca there were no agriculturalists, but let's assume as much. Another part of that argument, when people come up with things like, oh, Muhammad talks, the Quran talks about the ships and, fishing, etc. Well, I was born in an inland town. Didn't I know anything about fish and fishing? Didn't people tell stories? Uh, isn't the Red Sea maybe a day or 2 days away, even by like walking from the city of Mecca? So that's reading too much into the text. And unless there is some very specific information that could otherwise not have been known by people, like the kind of fishing reel that people use, etc., to me, those arguments don't make a whole lot of sense. You don't have to be personally an agriculturalist to know something about the agricultural world. You don't have to be a fisher yourself to know something about fishing. You don't have to be, knowledgeable about seafaring to know that being in the middle of a storm in the sea is a dangerous thing that would make you closer to God. So to me, like saying that, well, they're talking about olives, they must be from the north. I mean, aren't these things getting exchanged?
Right.
You know what I mean? To me, that's a ridiculous argument. And even if that's the case, again, I'm being capacious in my understanding of the Quran's geography. I'm extending it all the way to Sinai. And like these are normal things for people to notice. And the fact that it is mentioned, you could argue, conversely, is that they were fascinated by it. If it was like an everyday occurrence that they had olives, maybe the Quran wouldn't think about, olives as kind of a semi-sacred thing, or like, fishing and seafaring, etc. So both arguments to me are like unreasonable. These are things that people could observe. These are things that people could have learned from other people. So, and most importantly, like that to me is obvious. Again, 90%, more than 90% of ancient economies, it was based on agriculture.
Mm.
You didn't do it, somebody that you knew really well did it, for sure.
So we've already touched upon a couple of points in your responses as well that Dr. Al-Jalad made in his review. And his review has generated quite a lot of discussion. But I also wanted to ask about how you would respond to the running theme, basically, in his critique, that he obviously praises your book as a welcome catalyst that will engender a fruitful long-term discussion in the field, and he agrees with you on several premises. But he also argues that your book distorts the geographical signal and suffers from a southern bias in its examination of the epigraphic evidence. So just to briefly summarize some of the points he makes, he talks about your examination of the origin of certain Quranic rituals, which he argues has more convincing parallels in North Arabian material. He argues that your conclusion that the 5 gods of Noah's story are southern is not true, because he argues that they originate from across the peninsula. He says that there is an overcorrection in the rejection of Aramaic as a means of linguistic transmission of certain terms in the Quran, and that you overly rely on a comparative dictionary method, and that you underestimate the importance of Syriac and Paleo-Arabic evidence found outside the South that shows that maybe certain Aramaic loans would have taken place before there were any plausible Arabic Ethiopic language contacts. So the overarching argument basically is that the geographic center of gravity of your study is unduly shifted south. How would you respond to that sort of general theme?
Yeah, so let me make a couple of points. One is, people talk about cutting edge research. When it comes to the Arabian Peninsula, especially Safaitic and Paleo-Arabic, especially inscriptions from Northern Arabia, Ahmed al-Jallad's work is the cutting edge. So like somebody, like him taking the time, working on the book, reviewing, etc., like it's extremely beneficial for me. It's like I learn a lot from it. And I wish people could read the book with his review, right? So again, I really appreciate a lot of his remarks on these questions. And like I appreciate, most of it. I have some clarification on some points, maybe like some minor correction that I'll have actually write not necessarily a response to it, but maybe keeping the conversation in the same publication. So kind of preparing that just for people to know maybe. But so one clarification I would make is that what I think he observes as overcorrection derives from the fact that I was writing against the Syriacist dominance paradigm. As I said before, in order to argue against the pull to the north, I just wanted to show things from the south a little bit more, maybe forefront them to say, look, I mean, there's also this going on. But again, the book's argument is not that the Quran is coming from southern Arabia. It's very obvious that I'm reading this somewhat in a balance between the north and the south. And to me, it seems that the Quran is coming from Western Arabia, right? I'm not saying it's coming from the south. I have to make one point very clear. That's not the argument. I'm not saying the Quran came further south than what people claim or believe, etc. The second point is, again, nowhere in the book I make the argument that Southern Arabian and Ethiopian evidence should take precedence. And actually, it shouldn't. And there are multiple points for this. If you go back to my kind of elephant kind of metaphor, there are some evidence that should have more priority. And I fully agree with them that if you have, so let me make it even clearer. There are three dimensions to it: temporal, geographical, and linguistic. In the temporal sense, Paleo-Arabic inscriptions are the most important, as I say in the book. We don't have many of them, but when they exist, they're so important. They could trump, quote unquote, the other evidence when they exist. So whenever like he shows examples, that's fantastic. That's the kind of temporal part. The closer to the time of the Quran, maybe you could say it has more priority. You could say the same in the geographical part. When we have something from around Mecca, from around Medina, places like Tabuk, the general geography of the Hijaz, yeah, they should take precedence over South Arabian evidence. To me, that's obvious. The linguistic part of it is also Paleo-Arabic. Well, that's the same language as the language of the Quran, but also Safavidic and Ismaic. When evidence exists in these languages, which are in a dialect continuing with Arabic, they should, especially on the grounds of etymology and kind of transmission of words, they should take precedence. So again, the examples that he provides to me are only strengthening the argument that the Arabian epigraphy should provide the kind of most solid base for the Quran's context. And I'm never saying that it should be the South Arabian, right? The reason, again, some people might see it as overcorrection is because of how the other side overcorrected the context of the Quran. I was trying to show the other side. That's one way to put it. That's why, like a lot of the, for example, new material that he suggests, I take it as, that's great. That if we have, for example, more Safavidic evidence on a particular word, more paleographic evidence, that will only make, again, my basic arguments stronger. On another question, on the other question of, why are you using a lot of old South Arabian, ancient South Arabian? Well, one is I know them better. I have to admit, I know them better than Safavidic and other kind of ancient North Arabian texts. But we have to understand ancient South Arabian texts are giving you a huge, I guess, a literature in long texts that you can sometimes even follow the development of a word over centuries between monotheism and polytheism. So they're still really valuable in understanding some Quranic concepts, even though, as I say clearly, they do not necessarily end up being the source of an Arabic word, right? So for example, an inscription like RES 4176 that I use quite a bit in the Quran, 13 long lines talking about ritual hunt, pilgrimage, these are extremely valuable. Safavidic texts talk about similar things, but with often very little, short. They're extremely informative on certain topics, but some others, all South Arabian texts, are still very useful. CIH 541, an Abraha inscription from the Ma'arib dam. 130 odd lines. I mean, so sometimes when you're discussing certain words, obviously they also exist in other languages, especially in Safaitic. But for example, a word like adab, punishment, you can almost follow how it changed over time in the old South Arabian inscriptions. So again, like I don't argue at all that the Quran's original context should be moved from where it used to be to, Southern Arabia, Yemen, or something. That's not the argument. The argument is the Arabian epigraphy is very informative to understand the Quran. And the more Paleo-Arabic, the more Safaitic, the more Hismaic text that we have will enrich this even further and will be more, I would say, authoritative as sources than all South Arabian. But we have to look at them all together. You have to use them to understand, again, like this is more hands touching the elephant, so to speak. But my intention is definitely not moving the Quran further south. It's a reaction to a long-standing Syriacist paradigm pushing too far north and kind of maybe nudging the importance of south to make that imbalance. But otherwise, yeah, I thought it was pretty obvious that I'm not arguing for a southern origin for the Quran.
I mean, we have to pull it south in order to get it to the Hijaz, essentially.
I guess, yeah. That was especially the case when I wrote the dissertation. And now I'm more on the line of saying, look, I mean, like whenever, for example, Safaitic and Paleo-Arabic are not helping, let's look at all South Arabian. I would even concede that, that would be the best way to approach this. So I fully agree with them on many of those points, which is, North Arabia is the origin of many of these concepts. Some of them we don't have good evidence for, and we can use Arabic inscriptions that talk about literally the word ightasala to, wash yourself to get, out of ritual impurity when you had sex with a woman that is menstruating or like during pilgrimage. Like these are good evidence to see the continuity of religious ideas, not necessarily because they provide etymological ground for the Quran. That was my point.
And I just want to emphasize for people who have discussed this that there's clearly so much mutual respect and admiration between you and Dr. Al-Jalad. And the way that you are discussing it is so fruitful for the field as a whole. So I think the discussion between you is fascinating for everyone and actually beneficial.
Yeah, and again, I would definitely defer to him on matters, linguistic and epigraphic, because he's both an epigraphist and a linguist, and I'm a historian of religion. But another point is, again, I think this is a very important conversation, and I'm sure Ahmed agrees with this. And like this is the beginning of a conversation. So yes, inscriptions are now being used quite a bit, but this is the first book with all its maybe errors and mistakes. The first book that tries to address the question of, how can we shed light on the Quran through epigraphy? And I'm hoping many more will be published with, more evidence coming in, more methodological, I would say, interventions coming in. So I'm looking forward to that conversation, growing, and I think it should have started at some point.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it too. And I do believe that there will be more books or publications in line with yours coming out in the future. It's impossible. I don't see how they could not. And we'd like to thank you for actually being such a trooper for going through making it through all of these questions. This was probably the most questions that we asked in the interview, but seemed to get through it within a somewhat reasonable time. So so this is our last set. And how does your book search for the Quran's geographical origins give new meaning to its repeated reference to itself as a Quran Arabi?
Yeah, these were like my, I guess, concluding remarks in the book that, when the Quran says Quran Arabi, like I'm pretty sure it's talking about the language. But I just wanted to also point out that this was the title of the dissertation, right? An Arabian Quran. Uprooting the Quran from Arabia at the time with the evidence available, let's say 10, 20 years ago, maybe could have made sense as a good thought experiment, right? But now I think we're getting closer and closer to this understanding that, maybe there are sections of the Quran from elsewhere in different contexts, but like a lot of its religious language, religiosity, concepts that it talks about, etc. We have good evidence from the Arabian Peninsula itself. So when the Quran says it's a Quran Arabic, let's put it the Arabic way, it is probably saying more than just the language, but in order to understand it better, you have to understand that context a little bit better. And that context includes nusub stones, awthan, that context includes gods like Nasr and Wed, and the best way to look at these things are through epigraphy, because sometimes those are the only evidence, right? So that's why I think I'm kind of being cheeky with this a little bit, but when the Quran says Quran Arabi, I think that's part of what it means, that it's coming from this Arabian world, which would be best illuminated with some of these closer to home sources, is I guess was my point.
And you highlight how inscriptions have intrinsic limitations in the reconstruction of Islamic origins. Does your book push the current available epigraphic evidence as far as it can go in terms of what it can tell us about the birthplace of the Quran?
No way. I mean, this is like, we're talking about more than 100,000 inscriptions, big and small, when you can consider all of them. And you're talking about a closed corpus like the Quran, like 600 something pages. So there will be, I'm hoping, multiple ways to read the Quran through epigraphy, comprehensive, smaller in scale, and it has been going on in books and inscriptions anyway, in articles anyway. But I think, like, I just wanted to maybe start the conversation, point out some things specific to divine vocabulary, names, etc. But there's so much more to be done. I mean, like, way more than I was able to do in this book.
Despite your complete avoidance of Muslim sources as evidentiary supports and your total reliance on epigraphy combined with philology, your ultimate answer to the question which you started with, where does the Quran come from, is in complete accordance with the traditional Islamic narrative. The Quran emerged from the Hijaz, where we have Medina, Mecca, Badr, Hunain, etc. This parallels how similar avoidance of Muslim sources to date the Quranic text in favor of relying primarily on manuscript evidence, paleography, and radiocarbon dating have resulted in Western academic scholarship also affirming the Muslim narrative as to when the Quran was codified. An answer which, like yours, also pushed back against more revisionist conclusions that preceded it. Does this trend of validation of, at the very least, suggest that the bare bones of the traditional narrative are correct, and that academic skepticism towards them was misplaced, perhaps?
Yeah. It might come as surprising to some people if they have some assumptions about my research, but I honestly don't care whether my findings are vindicating the Islamic tradition. I'm hoping I came to this with, the same, I would say, revisionist reflexes, and let's see what will come out of this. Let's see, what the material evidence will tell. But of course, this maybe shows eventually, as a result, as a consequence, that revisionism in all fields really is exciting. It makes you consider a lot of very interesting questions, but eventually, you settle into a position that is kind of oscillating between, a very extreme position and the one that you started out with. So to me, along the way, I think we learned quite a few things that are not confirming the Islamic tradition. Yeah, I mean, in terms of where the Quran came from, maybe that's the case. But for example, again, we learned along the way that probably by using inscriptions mostly, that paganism had died for a while. Polytheism was gone for a while by the time we come to the Quran. So this is the kind of conclusion that you get. Yeah, we are geographically where we started out, but we learned a lot of things along the way. Maybe again, we will come up with a system of understanding the Quran's composition a little bit better. using epigraphy. The way, God's name changes over in the Quran over time, etc. So, although my goal wasn't vindicating the Islamic tradition, maybe that's how it ended up being the case. And this is a kind of cautionary tale for extreme revisionism. That's maybe one way to look at it. But you have to kind of note some of the lessons that you made along the way. What is not so clear from the Muslim sources, or what new knowledge we added to what we learned from the Muslims. So I think there was quite a bit of new lessons we got. So that's why, like, I wouldn't see it as a full vindication of the Islamic tradition. Maybe geographically so, but then there are many other things that the Muslim tradition probably got wrong. I kind of, again, tongue-in-cheek said in the conclusion that, I mean, they're often wrong when they're trying to identify where some words entered the Quran, for example, or like likely backgrounds, etc. But again, to me, I always saw this as a warning to people that are trying to be too extreme in their imagination of where revisionism can take you. So you probably end up where you started out in the first place.
So we finally reached our final question. Do you think it is at all viable anymore to study Islamic origins and Quranic exegesis without at least addressing in some form the pre-Islamic epigraphic evidence? Have we definitively entered an epigraphic trend as a paradigmatic interpretive framework for the field, which will only continue to gather pace as more inscriptions are discovered?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not saying that every work going forward should mention, inscriptions, etc. But think about this, like, it is one of the tools that you have. And in my opinion, it was being underutilized, that's all. So, there are multiple ways of working on the biblical history without necessarily touching upon epigraphic and archaeological evidence, but it is also a mainstay of, biblical studies, inscriptions, archaeological evidence. People use them all the time. And it's, to me, it was surprising when I started the dissertation. Of course, the picture has changed quite a bit, but there was not much. I'm not saying nothing, but really not much used for inscriptions in, Islamic origins, in discussions about the Quran. So I'm hoping this will be one of those tools in the toolkit. And there will be, again, I have to say, multiple ways of doing Quranic studies, multiple ways of studying Arabia, maybe without necessarily relying too much on the inscriptions. But those tools have to be there. People have to be familiar with them. And I'm not also denying the fact that this is a very extremely specialized knowledge, and not, everybody has access to it. And they should be excused for not being knowledgeable about this. And I always credit the fact that I used to, do my PhD at the University of Chicago, where it was possible for 2 or 3 of us coming together and asking a professor to teach us Nabatean. Convincing a comparative Semiticist to create a syllabus of ancient South Arabian when, 3 or 4 people would be mustered to take the course. My concern is that world is actually, academically, in the kind of larger picture, is going away, and it's going to be really difficult for people to, learn these languages, study them intensively, etc. I was lucky. I'm hoping more people will be lucky, so that they could study and then they could incorporate this kind of knowledge in their works. But that world is also dying. But at the same time, there are great advancements in the field. We used to have a great ancient South Arabian database. It was not up for a while, but I'm seeing it's up again. That's great. I mean, there's quite a bit more ancient South Arabian inscriptions that are not in the database, but many of them are. And of course, Ahmed is leading, Oceana. That's an incredible service to the field. And now, finally, we have Deconab for Nabatean and Nabatean Arabic and developing Arabic inscriptions, another database. So, like, we're covering most of the landscape. So, on the one hand, there's more accessibility, and I'm hoping people will take advantage of this. On the other hand, hopefully, they will also have the institutional structures to learn these languages and study them. So, hopefully, on a good note, that I'm hoping more of this will appear in the books. And it happened anyway. So a lot of people have already used it.
All right. And on that note, I mean, considering that your book just came out and people are still discussing it and writing reviews about it, do you have anything else coming down the pipeline? Any other projects that you
Yeah.
have in store for us, for our audience to look out for?
Yeah, so there's some things already in the pipeline, how slow publishing is. So I've a few things on, the kind of Aksumite connections.
Hmm.
I've one thing on pilgrimage. I already published on it, but using the Muslim sources a little bit more. But I'm hoping the next book will be a kind of expansion of chapter 3 on the question of, clusters in the Quran, maybe chronology. Unless people really convince me that I'm on the wrong track, I'll just try to do it. But there are reasons to write a monograph. If you're in the academic world, you know it. You write a monograph to get tenure, you write a monograph to get a promotion. A lot of the actual work happens in the article landscape. But so we'll see. I mean, there's some in the pipeline, some in the works. And hopefully at some point I'll convince myself to write a book as an expansion of chapter 3 of the first book.
All right. Well, thank you for being such an exciting guest. I feel like this was a very action-packed conversation. I felt like, if that's the right word to use, and we're totally grateful for you making a guest appearance on our platform, and we hope to have you on another time.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really enjoyed. 2 hours passed by so quickly, and let me say that this is a great platform to discuss these matters. So thank you so much for providing it.